In 1888, London was gripped with fear. A shadow moved through the dimly lit streets of Whitechapel, leaving behind a trail of brutally murdered women. The city was in panic, and the police were under immense pressure to catch the killer, who would later be known as Jack the Ripper. But despite the best efforts, he was never caught. The police were widely criticised, accused of incompetence and failure at every turn. The press mocked them, the public distrusted them, and conspiracy theories swirled. But in truth, the police were fighting an impossible battle. They were understaffed, undertrained, and overwhelmed, and in many ways they were doomed to fail before the case had even begun. So what went wrong? Why couldn't they stop him? Well, to understand that, we need to take a closer look at Victorian policing, the challenges officers faced, and how the Ripper case exposed the weaknesses of law enforcement at the time. So, as this is in the context of Jack the Ripper, or as they were known at the time, the Whitechapel murders, I'll go through each of the victims very briefly. If you'd like to know more about the victims though, I have made individual videos about each of them, and I'll link these in the description. 43-year-old Mary Ann Polly Nichols is now considered to be the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. She was killed on the 31st of August 1888 and was found by Charles Cross in Bucks Row as he made his way to work. Now, at the time, the Jack the Ripper name hadn't yet been introduced, and there had been another two murders earlier in the year, that of 45-year-old Emma Elizabeth Smith, killed on the 3rd of April, and 39-year-old Martha Tabram, who had been killed just a few weeks earlier on the 7th of August. And so at the time, Polly Nichols was considered the third victim. 48-year-old Annie Chapman was found murdered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street on the 8th of September 1888. There were two further victims in the very early hours of the 30th of September 1888, termed the double event. 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride was killed first in Dupfield Yard off Burner Street. Then less than an hour later, 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. The final canonical victim was 25-year-old Mary Jane Kelly, who was found in her own room in Miller's Court on the morning of the 9th of November 1888. Now, there were 4 further murders after this, but there are generally considered to be 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, the canonical 5. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. So now we've had a brief look at the victims. Why was Jack the Ripper never found? Number 1, the police force was in its infancy. Before the modern police were formed, policing in England was inconsistent at best. For centuries, the role of maintaining law and order was left to unspecialised groups such as watchmen or parish constables, who were often underpaid, untrained, and easily corruptible, with a reputation for laziness. Crime in London had grown rampant due to the massive influx to the city caused by the Industrial Revolution. By the mid-1800s, there were, and still are, 2 police forces in London, the Metropolitan Borough Police and the City of London Police. The two evolved separately. The Met was formed by the Home Secretary at the time, Sir Robert Peel, hence the name Bobbies and Peelers. And this was first in 1829 under the Metropolitan Police Act. At the time, the City of London Police wanted no part of it, but the Met was so successful they drove the criminals into the City of London, and therefore they had no choice than to follow suit. 10 years later, in 1839, the City of London Police were formed under the City of London Police Act. Now, both forces had been created and its officers trained to maintain public order rather than to investigate crimes. They walked beats, assigned routes on the lookout for crimes already taking place, and as a bit of a deterrent. The training and resources available to constables were still very limited in the 1800s. They were issued with a uniform, a stock, which was a leather collar to prevent garrotting, Wellington boots, a leather belt, a rattle, a truncheon, and a stovepipe hat to protect them in the event of blows to the head. They were nicknamed plods because the police boots had wooden soles and made distinctive plod sound as they walked. And this may have been good and bad. Good that the not-rights knew that there were police around, and probably did dissuade some. But for those who were intent on doing what they were doing, it would have been a bit of a warning. The criminals would have known the beats and could have easily waited until after the plods had passed before committing the crimes, and they would have known how much time they'd have before the police officer returned. So obviously it wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Now, due to the historical bribery, police officers were governed by very strict rules. Things still happened, of course, because people had a lot to gain from bribing policemen, though under these strict new rules it was much less common. Depending on the offence, PCs could be sacked, reprimanded or fined. On the 29th of September 1829, the first 1,000 PCs walked their beats for the first time. Unfortunately, the very first PC that went out that day, PC William Atkinson, was found drunk 4 hours later, where he was fired. Another, PC Edward Watkins of the City Police, the officer who would go on to find Catherine Eddowes, found himself in trouble just after his first anniversary as a PC. He was fined after being caught having sex with a woman whilst on duty. And this was followed by 2 drink-related instances of misconduct. He did manage to turn himself around though, and at the time of the murders, his behaviour and reports were impeccable. Number 2, mistrust between police and the public. So, given the chaotic and often corrupt nature of pre-modern policing, it's no surprise that by the time the Metropolitan Police were established, they weren't viewed as protectors by the public, especially by the working class residents of Whitechapel. The police force was something new, it was radical, and people considered it to be the equivalent of the government taking power, a police state. Many in the area had little faith in the police, having experienced harsh treatment or disinterest from law enforcement in the past. This deep mistrust made it incredibly difficult for the police to obtain the cooperation they required to solve the Ripper case. Along with having a bad reputation, the public felt that they should deal with the problems themselves. They felt that the police were meddling and that they didn't belong. As a result, many avoided the police. Obviously the criminals did, but also witnesses and even victims. Victims often didn't report crimes against them to the police. Witnesses turned a blind eye rather than deal with the authorities, and this alone had the potential to have left huge holes in the investigation. It's extremely unusual for serial killers to start with a full-blown murder, particularly one following the later pattern. They build up to it gradually. So it's entirely possible that Polly Nichols wasn't the first victim of Jack the Ripper, and neither were Martha Tabram or Emma Smith, if they were indeed killed by the Ripper. It's not out of the question then that potentially unknown victims who likely survived didn't report these attacks to the police for several reasons. Fear that they wouldn't be believed, fear that they would get into trouble, particularly if they were prostitutes, fear that nothing would be done, because attacks on women were common at that time, and just fear of the police in general. Could he have been stopped before if he'd been prosecuted for any lesser offences? And there were also unknown witnesses who didn't come forward, never reporting information that might have made the difference between the killer being apprehended and forgotten, and a string of murders that would remain unsolved 130 plus years later. It makes you wonder. So there was a huge paradox. People didn't like the police, but they were still expected to apprehend Jack the Ripper, whilst many kept potentially crucial information to themselves. Now, I'm not criticising them. We're all a product of our time. A lot of people now don't trust the police, though probably for different reasons, usually the few bad apples that we hear about, spoiling it for the rest. However, back then, as we talked about before, the police were formed out of a long tradition of untrustworthy individuals doing the policing, and so it's perfectly understandable. And when you're living in the horrible conditions that the residents of East London endured at the time, why would you trust authority? The very authority that allowed you to live in such squalor. If they were allowed to live like that, you can understand why those there didn't believe that the authorities cared about what was going on there, and the police were interfering. Number 3, the dark, crowded streets of Whitechapel. The geography of Whitechapel itself played a huge role in the investigation's failure. The area was a maze of narrow, poorly lit streets, densely populated with working class residents. In fact, it's often described as a rabbit warren. This made it incredibly easy for the Ripper and other criminals to hide or even disappear after committing the crimes. Another obstacle was lighting. There were street lamps made of ornate cast iron, but they gave off a limited amount of light, more of a yellow glow that didn't reach very far. And of course, as the residents of Whitechapel were poor, less money was spent there. They had fewer lamps than the other areas, making it mostly dark. The authorities knew that this was a problem. Charles Warren, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the time, wrote to the Office of the Board of Works saying, "The purlieus about Whitechapel are more imperfectly lighted, and that darkness is an important assistant to crime." Today, over 60% of violent crimes and assaults are committed in the dark. At that time, there are less witnesses. There's more chance of a sneak attack, weapons can be better hidden. If you do come across a witness, sight is obscured, likely a contributing factor to the contradictory witness descriptions, which we'll get to in a minute. Number 4, no forensics and inadequate investigations. At the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police had been around for 59 and 49 years respectively. And as mentioned earlier, the police were formed with a view to keeping order. There was no official detective branch at all in the first few years. On the 15th of August 1842, the Metropolitan Police's detective branch was formed and based at Scotland Yard. In 1870, this was increased with detectives at each division of the Metropolitan Police. The Criminal Investigation Department, CID, was formed in 1878, and this allowed for a more specialised, organised approach to criminal investigations and marked a shift in policing, with detectives focusing on solving serious crimes. So by the time of the murders in 1888, the concept of criminal detectives was still in its infancy. They had plainclothed officers, they were disguised, but these disguises were limited. Detectives might wear their hair a different way or maybe wear a different hat. However, this only went so far because experienced criminals could single them out. They stood upright, had a certain walk, a dead giveaway. So it helped, but only to a degree. Like today, detectives also had informants, narcs. For example, lodging house deputies and pub landlords who wanted to stay on the right side of the law. Additionally, due to the infancy of modern investigative methods, the crime scenes were often only crudely preserved. The police managed the scene as best they could, but this was difficult because crowds would gather to watch. After the death of Annie Chapman, due to the crowds gathered, Divisional Inspector Joseph Chandler covered her with a piece of canvas that was given to him by a member of the public. Of course, that would never be done now. It would contaminate the scene. And then, upon arrival at the mortuary, the body was washed. Now, police look for hairs, fingerprints, fibres, clues to lead them back to the murderer. But there were no such things at the time, and therefore nothing, as far as they knew, to contaminate. Many of the things we take for granted today weren't available at that time. There was no access to modern forensics such as DNA testing or blood typing. Without the ability to scientifically analyse evidence, the investigation was severely hampered. Despite this, the police in 1888 were in many ways the pioneers of modern police work in the numerous things they tried. They were surprisingly innovative, and these efforts are often downplayed now by comments such as, "Oh, they photographed Mary Jane Kelly's eyes, thinking that they may have held the image of the last thing they saw." Now, this might seem silly now, but at the time, photography was quite new, and it worked with coated plates which made a mirror-like image when exposed to sunlight. So doesn't it make sense that the same thing might have happened on a retina? Of course it didn't, but they tried it, just like they tried other things. Fingerprinting could also have turned out to be imprecise and useless in crime detection. though it didn't. Advances are made by trying things and disregarding those that don't work, and the police at the time certainly did that. Photography plays a large part of any modern investigation, and the Metropolitan Police wouldn't have a photography section until 1901, and the City Police until 1939. Before this, they used private photographers. Photographs were taken of the first 4 victims in the mortuary, not for investigative purposes, but for identification. The crime scene of Mary Jane Kelly's death in Miller's Court was the first to have crime scene photographs taken, as a way to preserve the evidence and the scene. Police also looked into the use of scent hounds and even trialled some trained dogs at the time. Now, dogs are used for all sorts of things in policing, such as cadaver dogs and drug dogs. Footprints left at the scene were examined, and if possible, for example, for footprints left in mud, casts were taken. Blood was also treated as a vital clue. DNA couldn't be obtained, nor could blood typing, and they didn't even have the ability to distinguish human and animal blood. But the police still searched for blood at the crime scene, looking for blood trails for a clue as to which way the perpetrator had gone. And they would also search the clothes of anyone suspected of murder. Clothing was expensive at the time, and those in the East End slums would likely have only owned one set. Clothing of the victims, however, which police today would consider vital evidence, was destroyed. They didn't have the means to examine it, as police would today, though it was used. A list of the victims' clothes and possessions was made to help with identification, because there was no ID back then. And this is a good example of early detective work. For example, when the list of Polly Nichols' possessions was made after her death, it was noted that her petticoat was stencilled as belonging to the Lambeth workhouse. And this led to a tentative identification from another inmate and friend, Polly Monk. After this, rumours spread and people came forward. Alan Holland, who had last seen Polly drunk on the corner of Whitechapel Road very shortly before she died, was able to give more information about Polly. Once Ellen had identified her in the mortuary, Polly's name was in the newspapers. Unfortunately, this is also how her family learned of her death. Her father, husband and eldest son contacted the police, who then made a formal identification, which is just terrible and leads us to the next point. Number 5, media sensationalism and public criticism. The media relentlessly criticised the police's every move. Newspapers like The Star and the Illustrated Police News painted the police as ineffective. They were criticised for the handling of the investigation and the failure to apprehend the murderer. But there's a lot of complexity there. The police were dealing with an unprecedented series of brutal murders in a very difficult, overcrowded part of London. The constant media scrutiny and sensationalist headlines added immense pressure, further eroding the public's trust in the police and fueling panic in the streets. Instead of supporting the police investigation, the media often hindered it, turning a tragedy into a spectacle. In reality, the police were working tirelessly in a complex and rapidly escalating situation. After each murder, officers searched the area for clues. They canvassed the area and houses for witnesses to find out if anyone had seen or heard anything. Police from other divisions were brought in to conduct house-to-house inquiries. The problem here was that a lot of people didn't want to talk. Some did give details of potential suspects, and the police investigated all of them. Even in October and early November, after the death of Catherine Eddowes, but before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, when people were beginning to wonder if the murders had ended, the police pressed on in their investigations. Despite what people believed, although there was some rivalry between the Metropolitan Police and the City Police, they worked together trying to find the perpetrator. And as the case attracted more public attention, the police were bombarded with hundreds of letters. I've heard the number 1400, though I don't know how reliable that figure is. Some of these letters were allegedly from the killer. The infamous Dear Boss letter, among others, taunted the police and played into the media frenzy. These letters were likely hoaxes, but they took up valuable time and resources. And rather than focusing on real evidence or leads, police had to sift through mountains of false claims and distractions. There's that contradiction again. The public and the press alike were critical of the police for the handling of the murders, whilst at the same time making their investigation much more difficult by wasting police time and failing to assist. Number 6, unreliable witnesses and mixed descriptions. Adding to the police's struggle was the reliability of witnesses. Many of the individuals who claimed to have seen the killer or observed suspicious activity were either intoxicated, distraught, or simply not paying attention, making it impossible to identify a solid suspect. And given the limited resources available to the police at the time, the investigation relied heavily on witness statements. Some people came forward claiming they had seen the victims with men shortly before the deaths, and this ought to have provided a good description of the murderer. But here are some various descriptions given by witnesses who claim to have seen the Ripper, although they do all agree that he was male. Height, just over 5'2", 5'5", 5'7", and 5'8". Hair colour, ginger, dark and fair. Facial hair, dark moustache, fair moustache, carroty moustache, and fair side whiskers. Build, medium, stout and slight. Age, 40, 30s, 45, 20s. General appearance, shabby genteel, shabby, very smart and foreign. So nothing much in common at all. It might have been because they weren't paying attention at the time. They were simply seeing somebody, not a person who was about to be killed with her potential killer. It was night time, and as discussed, the lighting was poor. And people didn't have watches and phones, so they could never be certain of the time. And people do tend to misremember. We want to put things together, and so sometimes, even unconsciously, we fit them together in a logical way, when often it's completely wrong. And people also inserted themselves into investigations, maybe out of boredom, maybe they thought there was some kind of reward, who knows, but it added to inaccurate information to the investigation and again wasted police time. And number 7, the final reason why Jack the Ripper was never caught, is that at the time there was no concept of a serial killer. At the time, the idea of a serial killer as we understand it simply didn't exist. Police generally viewed murders as isolated crimes, usually committed in the heat of the moment, for a clear motive like revenge, robbery, or jealousy. The idea that someone could kill multiple people over time for a psychological reason was not widely understood, and police had no framework for tracking or profiling such a murderer. That's not to say serial killers didn't exist before Jack the Ripper. History records many earlier cases like Gilda Ray in the 1400s, Elizabeth Bathory in the 1600s, and even the Thames Torso murders happening around the same time as the Ripper killings. However, these cases were often seen as one-off horrors rather than part of a wider pattern of behaviour. As mentioned before, it's likely that Jack the Ripper had victims before the canonical 5, and that the police were either unaware due to the reticence of the victims to report the crimes, or simply didn't connect them. If they had, this might have highlighted clues which might have caught the Ripper. At the end of October 1888, Assistant Commissioner Anderson sent Dr. Thomas Bond all of the medical and inquest information. Bond created a document of characteristics which he believed the killer would possess. The document was initially based on information from the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, but must have been updated immediately after the death of Mary Jane Kelly, as the final document was completed on the 10th of November 1888 and did include Mary Jane Kelly's murder. What he had created was the first criminal profile ever. And I'll probably make a video on this alone, it's very interesting, but I've highlighted it here because it's another example of the pioneering police work being done at the time, and it marks the first example of the police looking at a case from a psychological perspective. So there you have it, 7 reasons why Jack the Ripper was never caught. It's a case that still fascinates and frustrates people to this day. While modern advancements in forensic science may have changed how investigations are handled now, the circumstances in 1888 created a perfect storm for failure. But what do you think? Could the Ripper have been caught if things were different? Or is it a mystery that was destined to remain unsolved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.